The woman with eyes like storm clouds sat alone in the abandoned chapel, speaking truths no one wanted to hear. Then a carpenter with calloused hands walked through her door and changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rain hammered the cracked shingles of St. Margaret's Chapel on the outskirts of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The building had been empty for 7 years, ever since the congregation fled and the pastor locked the doors with trembling fingers. Now, it served as shelter for someone the town wished would disappear entirely. Elena Vasquez pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her dark hair plastered to her skull from the leak in the ceiling above. Water dripped steadily into a rusted bucket, each drop echoing through the hollow space like a countdown. She pulled her threadbare shawl tight around her shoulders and closed her eyes, trying to block out the visions that came whether she welcomed them or not. The first prophecy had arrived on her 18th birthday, 3 years ago, like lightning, splitting her skull in two. She had been working at Henderson's general store, sweeping flour from wooden floors when the world suddenly tilted sideways. Images flooded her mind with brutal clarity. Mrs. Henderson clutching her chest, falling. Behind the counter, the store keys scattered across blood-stained boards. Elena had screamed, dropping the broom, pointing at the woman who stood perfectly healthy just 10 feet away. "You're going to die," Elena had whispered, the words tumbling from her lips like stones. 3 days. Your heart will stop while you're counting the till. Mrs. Henderson had laughed nervously, but her face had gone pale. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Elena and the door. By evening, word had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The Vasquez girl had finally cracked. Just like her grandmother before her, Elena had begged Mrs. Henderson to see a doctor, had pleaded with her to stay home, to rest, to listen. But fear makes people stubborn, and Mrs. Henderson had shown up, to work each day with defiant determination, as if her presence alone could prove Elena wrong. On the 3rd day, she collapsed while counting quarters. Her heart simply stopped, just as Elena had seen. The funeral was held on a Tuesday. Elena wasn't invited. That was when the real troubles began. Word of Mrs. Henderson's death reached neighboring towns, and soon people were whispering about the girl who could see tomorrow. Some came seeking answers about their own futures, clutching worn photographs in desperate hopes. Others came with accusations and threats, convinced that seeing death meant causing it. Elena tried to explain that the visions chose her, not the other way around. She couldn't control what she saw or when she saw it. The images arrived like uninvited guests, vivid and terrible, and always true. She had foreseen the Miller barn burning 2 weeks before lightning struck. She had seen young Tommy Patterson's broken leg a month before he fell from the oak tree behind the schoolhouse. She had witnessed the Riverside Bridge collapse in her dreams, had tried to warn the county commissioners, had been dismissed as a hysterical girl with an overactive imagination. 23 people died when the bridge gave way during the spring flood. After that, the town's fear transformed into something darker. Windows were broken on her family's small house. Crosses were burned in their yard. Her father, a quiet man who worked at the lumber mill, lost his job when customers refused to do business with anyone connected to that witch girl. Her mother, once a respected seamstress, found her services no longer required by the ladies of Millbrook. The family had tried to leave, had packed their belongings into a borrowed wagon and headed west toward her uncle's farm in Ohio. But the visions followed. Elena everywhere. In the small town of Cedar Falls, she had seen the schoolhouse fire before it happened. In Brookfield, she had predicted the death of the mayor's son in a riding accident. Each time, her warnings were ignored until tragedy struck exactly as she had foreseen. By the time they reached the 3rd town, angry mobs were already waiting for them. Word had spread along the traveling routes about the cursed girl who brought death wherever she went. Her family was run out of town after town, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes with stones thrown at their retreating wagon. Eventually, her parents could take no more. The weight of being outcasts, of watching their daughter suffer for gifts she never asked for, had broken something fundamental in their marriage. Elena's mother had started drinking, spending her days staring out windows with hollow eyes. Her father had grown silent and distant, flinching whenever Elena tried to touch his hand. One morning, Elena had awakened to find them gone. A note on the kitchen table, written in her mother's careful script, apologized for their weakness. They loved her, the letter said, but they couldn't live in a world where tomorrow was always painted in shadows. They had left money hidden beneath the loose floorboard, enough for a few months if she was careful. Elena had folded the letter with steady hands, had counted the coins twice, and had walked out of the rented room they could no longer afford. She had nowhere to go except back to the one place that might offer shelter, the abandoned chapel where she had once attended Sunday services as a child. Margaret's had been built by Irish immigrants in 1847, its gray stone walls designed to withstand Pennsylvania winters and the passage of time. But it couldn't withstand the fear that drove its congregation away when Elena's reputation spread. Pastor Mackenzie had been a kind man, had tried to counsel Elena about her gift, had suggested that perhaps God had chosen her for a special purpose. But when his own parishioners started staying away, when the collection plates grew lighter each week, when whispers about harboring a witch began circulating, even his faith had wavered. The day he handed Elena the chapel keys, his hands had shaken. "I'm sorry, child," he had whispered. "I believe you're blessed, not cursed, but I'm just one man, and they're many. Maybe someday they'll understand." That had been 8 months ago. Elena had learned to survive on what little charity still existed in the world. Day-old bread from the baker's wife who left loaves outside the chapel door after dark. Clothes donated by the seamstress who had once been her mother's friend, coins pressed into her palm by farmers who secretly hoped she might warn them of coming droughts or early frosts. But mostly, she lived in isolation. The visions still came, sometimes gentle as whispered prayers, sometimes violent as thunderclaps. She saw Mrs. Patterson's pregnancy months before the woman knew she was expecting. She witnessed the bank robbery that would happen next spring, watched in her mind as masked men rode into town on a Tuesday morning. She foresaw the harsh winter approaching, saw families huddled around empty hearths, saw children with hollow cheeks and frosted breath. She tried to warn people, left anonymous notes under doors, whispered predictions to anyone who would listen. But her reputation preceded her everywhere. The woman who had predicted 3 deaths in as many months, who had foreseen disasters that seemed to follow in her wake like hungry wolves. Fear had transformed her gift into a curse, and the town of Millbrook treated her accordingly. Elena spent her days reading from the Bible she had found in the chapel's vestry, its leather binding cracked but its pages still crisp. She had never been particularly religious before the visions began, but now she searched the scriptures for understanding, for some explanation of why God would burden her with knowledge of tomorrow's sorrows. The prophets of old had faced similar struggles, she learned. Isaiah had been mocked and dismissed. Jeremiah had been thrown into a pit. Ezekiel had been called a madman. Perhaps this was simply the price of seeing what others couldn't, of carrying tomorrow's weight in today's heart. But understanding didn't make the loneliness easier to bear. Elena had been alone for so long that she sometimes forgot the sound of her own voice, would spend entire days without speaking a single word aloud. The chapel's acoustics amplified every breath, every footstep, every whispered prayer, making her acutely aware of her solitude. She had tried to stop the visions. Once, had drunk herself into unconsciousness with sacramental wine stolen from the vestry. But even in her drunken stupor, the images had come, clearer, more violent, more detailed than ever before. She had awakened to find herself screaming prophecies about a fire that would consume the Garrett farmhouse, about twin sisters who would drown in Miller's Pond, about secrets that would tear apart the Mitchell family before autumn's end. That every prediction had come true within a fortnight. Now Elena no longer fought the visions. She accepted them like a farmer accepts weather, with resignation and preparation. When images of future sorrows filled her mind, she wrote them down in a leather journal she had found among the chapel's abandoned belongings, not because anyone would listen to her warnings, but because the act of recording them somehow lessened their weight in her heart. The rain outside intensified, driven horizontal by wind that rattled the chapel's stained glass windows. Elena pulled her knees to her chest and listened to the storm's fury. In her mind, she could see it passing by morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright. The Hendersons' apple orchard would lose several branches, but no one would be hurt. Old Mr. Fitzgerald's fence would blow down, but his cattle would stay safe in the barn. Sometimes her visions showed small mercies alongside the larger tragedies. A sudden crack of thunder made her jump, followed immediately by the sound of something heavy hitting the chapel's front door. Elena froze, listening intently. Animals sometimes sought shelter during storms, but this sound had been different, deliberate. Another thud. Then the screech of rusty hinges as the door swung open. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps echoed through the chapel's nave. Heavy boots on stone floors, steady and unhurried. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows near the altar, hoping whoever had entered would take shelter briefly and then leave. The footsteps paused about halfway down the aisle. "Hello," a man's voice called out, deep and gentle. "I saw light from the windows. I don't mean any harm. Just seeking shelter from the storm." Elena held her breath, motionless as carved marble. Few people ventured near the chapel anymore, and fewer still would enter after dark. Most of Millbrook's residents believed the building was cursed now, tainted by her presence. "I know someone's here," the voice continued, closer now. "I can see the candlelight from the altar. Please, I'm not here to cause trouble." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the chapel's interior for a brief moment. Elena caught a glimpse of a tall figure silhouetted against the stained glass, water dripping from his clothes onto the stone floor. In that instant, her mind exploded. With vision, she saw him clearly, a man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, standing in sunlight outside a half-built house. She saw him laughing with children who called him Papa, saw him holding a woman with Alana's own face as she cradled a newborn baby. She saw years stretching ahead, filled with ordinary miracles, shared meals, gentle conversations, quiet love that grew stronger with each passing season. But threaded through these images of joy were darker visions. She saw the man facing angry crowds who called for Elena's banishment. She saw him standing between her and those who would do her harm, his voice steady as he defended her gift. She saw him holding her during the nights when visions came like knives, his presence the only thing that kept her anchored to sanity. And she saw his name, written in her own handwriting in a letter she would someday send, Marcus Thompson, carpenter. And believer, the man who would look at her cursed gift and call it blessed. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left Elena gasping as if she had run for miles. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself upright, stepping out of the shadows and into the flickering candlelight. The man stood about 10 feet away, his hat dripping water onto the floor. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 25 or 26, with sandy brown hair and eyes the color of warm honey. His clothes were simple but well made, work shirt, sturdy pants, boots that had seen honest labor. In his hands he held a canvas bag that looked heavy with tools. When he saw her, He didn't recoil or cross himself or show any of the fear she had grown accustomed to seeing in human faces. Instead, he simply nodded, as if finding a young woman alone in an abandoned chapel was the most natural thing in the world. "Evening, miss," he said politely. "Marcus Thompson. I was traveling through when the storm hit. Mind if I waited out?" "Here." Elena stared at him, her voice caught somewhere between her heart and her throat. The visions had shown her this moment, but experiencing it felt entirely different. She could smell sawdust on his clothes, could see the small scar above. His left eyebrow, could hear the genuine kindness in his voice that no prophecy could have prepared her for. "You shouldn't be here," she finally managed to whisper. "This place, You're the one they call the prophet," Marcus said matter-of-factly, setting his bag down near a pew. "Elena Vasquez. I heard about you in the last 3 towns." Elena's blood turned to ice water. "Then you know what I am." "What they say I am." Marcus pulled off his wet hat and ran his fingers through his damp hair. "I know what they say. Question is, what do you say?" The simple question caught Elena off guard. No one had asked for her own understanding of her gift in months. They told her what she was: witch, demon, harbinger of doom. They never asked what she believed about herself. "I see things," she said slowly. "Things that haven't happened yet. Things that always come true." "Must be a heavy burden," Marcus said. His voice gentle. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Heavy? It's destroyed everything I've ever loved. My family, my home, my future. People look at me like I'm death itself walking among them." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the candlelight. Then he said something that changed everything. "Seems to me that knowing tomorrow's troubles might be the greatest gift God could give someone. Means you can help people prepare. Means you can warn them when danger's coming. Means you care about strangers enough to carry their sorrows before they even know they have them." Elena's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for months. "You don't understand. The things I see, they're terrible. People die. Families are torn apart. Disasters come, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop them." "Maybe," Marcus said, settling onto a pew as if he planned to stay a while. "But you still try to warn them, don't you? Even when they call you names, even when they drive you away, you still try to help." "Yes," Elena whispered. "Then you're not cursed," Marcus said with quiet certainty. "You're blessed. And anyone too blind to see that is the one with the real problem." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the chapel, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 3 years, Elena Vasquez was not alone with her terrible gift. Someone sat in the shadows with her. Someone who looked at her prophecies and saw blessing instead of curse. Someone who had walked through a storm to find her, exactly as she had foreseen. Marcus stayed through the night, and by dawn, Elena discovered what it meant to have someone listen without judgment. The storm passed before midnight, leaving behind a crystalline silence that filled every corner of the chapel. Elena sat cross-legged on the floor near the altar, her journal open in her lap, watching Marcus sleep on the hard wooden pew. He had folded his coat into a makeshift pillow and settled down as naturally as if he belonged there, untroubled by the stories that kept most people awake with fear. She studied his face in the dying candlelight, memorizing features she had only glimpsed in her visions. The strong jawline softened by sleep, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the carpenter's calluses visible even in the dim glow. Her gift had shown her fragments of their future together, but seeing him here, breathing quietly in the sacred space she had claimed as refuge, felt both surreal and inevitable. Elena had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, new visions cascaded through her consciousness like water through a broken dam. But these weren't the usual prophecies of disaster and sorrow. Instead, she saw moments of unexpected grace. Mrs. Patterson safely delivering her baby, despite complications, that would have claimed both their lives. The bank robbery thwarted because the sheriff heeded an anonymous warning. Families preparing for the harsh winter and surviving because someone had cared enough to tell them what was coming. For the first time, Elena glimpsed how her curse might transform into something resembling a blessing. When Marcus stirred at first light, Elena was writing frantically in her journal, trying to capture every detail of the new visions before they faded. He sat up slowly, stretching muscles cramped from sleeping on unforgiving wood, and watched her work without interrupting. "More prophecies?" he asked when she finally set down her pen. Alana nodded, closing the journal carefully. "Different ones. Better ones somehow." Marcus stood and walked to the nearest window, gazing out at the morning landscape. The storm had left the world washed clean, with puddles reflecting the pale sky like scattered mirrors. "What did you see?" Elena hesitated. She had learned to keep her visions private, had stopped sharing them after too many people accused her of making predictions come true through dark magic. But something in Marcus's patient attention invited honesty. "I saw people listening," she said quietly. "Really listening, not just waiting for me to stop talking so they could call me crazy. I saw warnings being heeded, preparations being made. I saw my gift helping instead of destroying." Marcus turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "What changed?" Elena looked up at him, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "You did. In the visions you were there. Standing with me when people got angry, helping me find ways to share what I'd seen without frightening everyone. You made them understand that prophecy isn't the same as judgment." A comfortable silence settled between them. Marcus retrieved his canvas bag and removed a leather-wrapped bundle that proved to contain bread, cheese, and dried apples. He divided the food carefully, offering Elena the larger portion. "I'm not much for big speeches," he said as they shared the simple breakfast. "But it seems to me that if God gives someone the ability to see tomorrow, it's probably because he wants them to help shape it." Elena bit into the bread, tasting kindness along with the grain. "The townspeople don't see it that way. To them, I'm either lying for attention or consorting with evil spirits. Either way, I'm dangerous." "People fear what they don't understand," Marcus agreed. "Doesn't make them right. Just makes them human." After breakfast, Marcus shouldered his bag and walked toward the chapel door. Elena's heart sank, assuming he would leave like everyone else eventually did. But instead of departing, he turned back to her with a question that changed everything. "Mind if I stay in town for a few days? I heard they're building a new schoolhouse, and I could use the work." Elena stared at him. "You want to stay? Here? Even knowing what I am?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "Especially knowing what you are. Seems like this town could use someone who cares about tomorrow." For the next 3 days, Marcus worked on the schoolhouse during daylight hours and returned to the chapel each evening. He brought Elena news from town, shared meals with her, and listened as she described the visions that came with increasing frequency and clarity. The people of Millbrook watched this development with growing unease. Marcus Thompson was clearly a decent man, skilled with his hands and respectful in his dealings with others. But his association with the prophet girl raised uncomfortable questions. Some whispered that she had bewitched him. Others suggested he was as mad as she was. A few wondered if perhaps they had misjudged Elena entirely. On the 4th morning, Elena experienced a vision so vivid and urgent that she nearly collapsed from its intensity. She saw flames consuming the Garrett farmhouse, watched in horror as the family slept unaware while fire crept up the stairs toward their bedrooms. The vision carried the sharp scent of smoke and the terrible sound of timber crashing down. When Marcus arrived that evening, he found Elena pacing frantically around the altar, her journal clutched against her chest. "The Garretts," she said without preamble. "Their house is going to burn. Tonight, after midnight. The whole family will die unless someone warns them." Marcus didn't question or doubt. He simply asked, "What starts the fire?" Elena closed her eyes, calling back the vision's details. A candle in the kitchen. Mrs. Garrett left it burning when she checked on baby William. The holder is cracked, and the wax will drip onto the curtains. Then we stop it, Marcus said matter-of-factly. Elena stared at him. We? Marcus, if you're seen with me, if people think you believe my prophecies, let them think, Marcus interrupted. A family's life is worth more than reputation. They walked through the dark streets of Millbrook like ghosts, avoiding the main roads where late-evening conversations might betray their presence. Elena had never attempted to personally intervene in one of her visions before. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, but Marcus's steady presence beside her provided an anchor of courage she had never possessed alone. The Garrett farmhouse sat at the edge of town, surrounded by fields that would soon be harvested. Lamplight glowed in the kitchen window, exactly as Elena had foreseen. She could see Mrs. Garrett moving about inside, finishing the day's final tasks before retiring. How do we warn them without sounding insane? Elena whispered. Marcus studied the house for a moment, then pointed to the barn. See that pile of dry hay near the fence? And those tools left out in the weather? I'll tell them I was checking on a job site and noticed fire hazards. Suggest they might want to be extra careful with open flames tonight. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Marcus approached the front door with the confident bearing of a man on legitimate business, while Elena waited in the shadows, ready to run if things went badly. She watched through the kitchen window as Marcus spoke with Mr. Garrett, gesturing toward the barn and pointing out various safety concerns. Mrs. Garrett joined the conversation, nodding seriously as Marcus explained the dangers of leaving tools exposed to moisture and hay stacked too close to structures. And you might want to check that candle holder, Elena heard Marcus say, his voice carrying clearly through the open door. The wax is pooling strangely. Wouldn't want it dripping onto anything flammable. Mrs. Garrett immediately moved to examine the candle, exclaiming when she discovered the crack in the ceramic base. She blew out the flame and moved the holder to a safer location. Thanking Marcus profusely for his thoughtfulness, Elena felt the vision's urgency drain away, like water from a broken pitcher. The future had shifted, the terrible destiny averted by a carpenter's practical wisdom and a prophet's forewarning. When Marcus rejoined her in the shadows, Elena was trembling with relief and amazement. They listened, she whispered. They actually listened because you gave me the right words to say, Marcus replied. Your gift saw the danger. I just helped translate it into something they could understand and act on. Walking back to the chapel, Elena felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time, her prophecy had brought salvation instead of sorrow. The vision of fire and death had become a vision of protection and life, but their success that night would soon bring new challenges. Word spread quickly through Millbrook about Marcus Thompson's timely warning to the Garretts. By the next afternoon, several other families had asked him to inspect their properties for similar hazards. Marcus obliged, using Elena's insights to identify problems before they became disasters. When Mrs. Patterson's pregnancy took a dangerous turn, exactly as Elena had foreseen, Marcus quietly suggested that the midwife might want to have the doctor standing by just in case. When the Miller barn showed signs of weakness that would lead to collapse during the next heavy snow, Marcus pointed out the structural problems to Mr. Miller, who reinforced the building before winter arrived. Each successful intervention strengthened the bond between Elena and Marcus, but it also drew unwanted attention. Reverend Shaw, who had replaced Pastor Mackenzie at the town's main church, began preaching sermons about false prophets and the danger of trusting in signs and wonders. Sheriff Dalton started asking pointed questions about Marcus's uncanny ability to predict problems before they occurred. The situation came to a head on a Wednesday evening when Elena experienced her most disturbing vision yet. She saw Sheriff Dalton and 3 other men approaching the chapel with torches and rope. their faces twisted with righteous anger. She watched them drag her from the altar, accusing her of witchcraft and conspiracy. In the vision, Marcus tried to defend her but was overwhelmed by the mob's fury. When Marcus arrived at the chapel that night, Elena met him at the door with wild eyes and trembling hands. "You have to leave," she said urgently. "Tonight. They're coming for me, and if you're here, they'll hurt you too." Marcus listened as she described the vision, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the chapel's scarred wooden door. "When?" he asked finally. "Tomorrow night, just after sunset. The sheriff will come with volunteers from Reverend Shaw's congregation. They believe you're under my influence, that I've corrupted you with dark magic." Marcus set down his bag and walked to the altar, kneeling to examine something on the floor. When he stood, he was smiling grimly. "Show me exactly where they enter, how they move through the space, what they say." Elena was confused. "Marcus, you don't understand. You need to leave town before they connect you to me any further." This vision was different from the others. I couldn't see how to change it. "That's because you're thinking like someone who runs from trouble," Marcus said calmly. "I'm thinking like someone who prepares for it." He spent the next hour questioning Elena about every detail of her vision, mapping out the mob's approach, timing their arrival, understanding their motivations. As they talked, a plan began to emerge that was both simple and audacious. What if they found exactly what they expected to find? Marcus mused, but not in the way they expected to find it. Elena studied his face, seeing determination where she had feared to find doubt. "You're not leaving." "No," Marcus said firmly. "I'm not leaving. Tomorrow night, we're going to show this town what prophecy really looks like when it's wielded with wisdom instead of fear." Elena felt a familiar tingling in her mind, the sensation that always preceded a new vision. But this time, instead of seeing disaster approaching, she saw possibility unfolding. She saw Marcus standing before an angry crowd, his voice calm and steady as he spoke truths they had never considered. She saw faces changing from suspicion to surprise to something that might eventually become understanding. And for the first time since her gift had manifested, Elena saw herself standing tall instead of cowering, speaking her truth instead of hiding from it. The future was about to change, and this time she would help shape it instead of simply enduring it. The confrontation came exactly as Elena had foreseen. But Marcus had prepared something the angry mob never expected. The truth spoken with unshakable conviction. Thursday passed with agonizing slowness. Elena found herself checking the chapel windows every few minutes, watching for signs of the approaching storm she knew would arrive with human faces instead of rain clouds. Marcus worked on the schoolhouse as usual, his demeanor so calm that several townspeople commented on his apparent peace of mind. They had no idea he was setting the stage for the most important performance of his life. That afternoon, while most of Millbrook's residents went about their daily business, Marcus made careful preparations. He visited the general store and purchased materials that seemed innocuous enough: paper, ink, several candles, and a small hand mirror. At the blacksmith's shop, he commissioned a simple iron bracket, explaining that he needed it for a carpentry project. No one questioned the soft-spoken craftsman who had proven so helpful to their community. Elena spent the day in prayer and meditation, seeking clarity about what lay ahead. The visions that had plagued her for years seemed strangely quiet, as if her gift was holding its breath before revealing some crucial truth. She wrote extensively in her journal, documenting not just her prophecies, but her thoughts and feelings about the transformation taking place within her. For so long, she had been a passive vessel for divine revelation. Tomorrow night, she would finally become an active participant in shaping the future she had been shown. As sunset approached, Marcus returned to the chapel carrying a canvas satchel and wearing an expression of quiet determination. He had changed from his work clothes into a clean white shirt and dark trousers, looking more like a preacher than a carpenter. Are you ready? He asked Elena, setting down his bag near the altar. Elena smoothed her best dress, the blue one her mother had sewn before their world fell apart. I've been ready for 3 years. I just didn't know what I was getting ready for. Marcus began arranging items from his satchel around the chapel's interior. He placed candles at specific intervals, positioned the mirror to catch and reflect their light, and set up sheets of paper in precise locations. To a casual observer, it might have looked like preparation for some sort of ritual or ceremony. What you're seeing, Marcus explained as he worked, is theater. Not deception, but presentation. These people expect to find a witch practicing dark magic. Instead, they're going to discover something that challenges everything they think they know about prophecy and faith. Elena watched him transform the familiar space into something that felt both sacred and dramatic. What if your plan doesn't work? What if they're too frightened to listen? Marcus paused in his preparations, meeting her eyes with steady confidence. Then we'll have tried something better than running or hiding. Sometimes the best way to change people's minds is to show them exactly what they're looking for, but in a context they never expected. As darkness settled over Millbrook, Elena felt the familiar tingle of approaching vision. But this time, instead of seeing distant futures, she witnessed events unfolding in real time. Sheriff Dalton was gathering his volunteers outside Reverend Shaw's church. The men carried torches and wore expressions of grim purpose, convinced they were about to root out evil from their community. "They're coming," Elena whispered. 5 men. The sheriff, Reverend Shaw, Thomas Bentley, James Morrison, and Samuel Hayes. They'll approach from the east, expecting to find us unprepared. Marcus nodded, lighting the last of the candles he had positioned throughout the chapel. The space now glowed with warm, steady light that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. He handed Elena a piece of paper covered with his careful handwriting. "When they arrive, I want you to read this aloud. Don't pause. Don't hesitate. Just speak the words clearly and with conviction. Can you do that?" Elena glanced at the paper, recognizing biblical verses mixed with Marcus's own eloquent phrases about the nature of divine gifts and human responsibility. "I can do it. But Marcus, what about you? In my vision, they blamed you for believing in me." Marcus smiled, the expression both gentle and fierce. "Let them blame me. I've carried worse burdens than the disapproval of frightened men." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the church grounds, exactly as Elena had foreseen. Heavy boots on wet grass, the crackle of torches, low voices muttering prayers and curses in equal measure. Marcus positioned himself near the altar while Elena stood in the center of the nave, the written words clutched in her hands. The chapel door burst open with violent force, splintering slightly where the old wood met the rusty hinges. Sheriff Dalton strode through first, his hand resting on his pistol, followed by the 4 other men Elena had seen in her vision. Their torch flames wavered in the sudden draft, creating a chaos of light and shadow that made the scene feel biblical in its intensity. "Elena Vasquez," Sheriff Dalton announced in his official voice, "you're under arrest for practicing witchcraft and corrupting the morals of this community." But Elena had already begun reading from Marcus's carefully prepared text, her voice rising clear and strong above the sheriff's pronouncement. "And it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams." These are not my words, Sheriff Dalton. These are the words of the Apostle Peter, speaking on the day of Pentecost about the gifts God would give to his people. The men stopped in their tracks, clearly unprepared for scripture to be quoted back at them. Reverend Shaw stepped forward, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Don't you dare twist holy words to justify your dark practices, girl. We know what you are." Elena continued reading, her voice gaining strength with each word. I am Elena Vasquez, daughter of James and Maria, baptized in this very town when I was 12 years old. I am a woman who sees tomorrow's troubles and tries to warn today's people. I am someone who weeps for strangers' sorrows and celebrates their joys before they know they exist. If that makes me a witch, then every prophet in the Bible was practicing witchcraft. Marcus stepped forward then, moving into the candlelight where his calm presence commanded immediate attention. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "you've come here expecting to find evil. Instead, you've found a young woman reading scripture and a carpenter who believes God still speaks to his people. If that troubles you, perhaps the problem isn't with us." Thomas Bentley, a farmer whose crops Elena had helped save from an early frost, shifted uncomfortably. "Thompson, we know you're a good man, but she's got you fooled somehow. These prophecies of hers, they're unnatural." "Unnatural?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. Was it unnatural when she warned the Garretts about fire hazards, preventing their house from burning down? Was it unnatural when she suggested Mrs. Patterson might have complications in childbirth, allowing the doctor to be prepared? Was it unnatural when she predicted the weak timbers in Miller's barn, giving him time to repair them before they collapsed? Elena watched the men's faces as Marcus spoke, seeing confusion replace certainty. These were practical men who understood cause and effect, who valued results over theology. Marcus was speaking their language, translating her divine gift into terms they could comprehend and accept. Sheriff Dalton frowned, clearly struggling with the contradiction between his preconceptions and the evidence Marcus presented. But the things she sees, death, disaster, tragedy. No good person would know such things in advance. Elena felt a new vision beginning to form, and this time she didn't fight it. The images came with crystalline clarity, Sheriff Dalton's own future, filled with both sorrow and joy, loss and redemption. She saw his wife recovering from an illness that would strike next month, saw his son returning safely from the war that was brewing in distant states, saw the sheriff himself making decisions that would define his legacy in this community. "Sheriff," Elena said quietly, setting aside Marcus's prepared text, "your wife is going to fall ill next month. A fever that starts small but grows dangerous. The doctor will want to bleed her, but that's not what she needs. Cool cloths and willow bark. Tea will break the fever. Your son William will come home from his travels before Christmas, bringing news of a woman he wants to marry. She's a good woman, though not from here, and you'll worry about accepting her until you see how happy she makes him." The chapel fell silent except for the soft crackling of candle flames. Sheriff Dalton's face had gone pale, his hand falling away from his weapon. "How could you possibly know about William?" he whispered. "I haven't heard from him in 6 months." "Because I see tomorrow," Elena said simply. "Not to frighten people, but to help them prepare. Your son is safe, Sheriff. He's happy. And he's coming home to share that happiness with his family." Reverend Shaw stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion that might have been anger or fear or something else entirely. "Even if what you say is true, even if these visions come from God instead of the devil, what gives you the right to speak for the Almighty?" Elena looked at him with compassion, remembering how Pastor Mackenzie had struggled with the same questions before fear overcame his faith. "I don't speak for God, Reverend. I just listen when he speaks to me. The same way you listen when you pray, when you study scripture, when you seek guidance for your congregation. The only difference is that my answers come as pictures of tomorrow, instead of words about today." Marcus moved to stand beside Elena, his presence a solid reminder that she was no longer alone in her calling. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the group with quiet authority, "you came here tonight because you were afraid. Afraid of something you didn't understand, afraid of changes in your community, afraid that maybe God works in ways that don't fit your expectations. I understand that fear. But I've spent the last week watching Elena use her gift to help people, to protect families, to prevent tragedies before they occur. If that's witchcraft, then I pray God sends more witches to our world." James Morrison, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Thompson's right about one thing. The girl hasn't hurt anyone. If anything, she's helped. Maybe we've been looking at this all wrong." Samuel Hayes nodded slowly. "My brother lives over in Cedar Falls. He told me stories about a girl who predicted their schoolhouse fire. Saved a dozen children's lives, he said. Could be we're talking about the same person." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes, not from sadness but from a relief so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. These men, who had come to arrest her as a witch, were beginning to see her gift for what it truly was, a blessing disguised as a burden, a responsibility rather than a curse. Sheriff Dalton holstered his pistol completely, his official demeanor softening into something more human. "Miss Vasquez, I owe you an apology. We came here tonight based on fear and gossip, not facts and evidence. That's not the kind of law enforcement this community deserves." Reverend Shaw was the last holdout, his theological worldview struggling to accommodate what he had witnessed. "Even if I accept that your visions are genuine," he said slowly, "what place do you have in a God-fearing community? How do we integrate prophecy into our daily worship and life?" Elena smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the candles surrounding them. "The same way the early church did, Reverend. With prayer, with discernment, with community support. I don't want to replace your ministry. I want to support it. When I see troubles coming, I can help you prepare your congregation. When I see blessings approaching, I can help you give thanks in advance." Marcus pulled out a letter from his coat pocket, unfolding it carefully. "Pastor Mackenzie left this for Elena when he gave her the chapel keys. I think now might be the right time to share what he wrote." Elena recognized her former pastor's handwriting immediately, and her heart swelled with gratitude for his faith in her. Even when his courage had faltered, Marcus read aloud, "To whoever finds this letter along with Elena Vasquez, I believe this young woman carries a genuine gift from God. My failure was not in recognizing her calling, but in lacking the strength to defend it when fear overtook my congregation. If you are reading this, perhaps you have the courage I lacked. Help her use her gift wisely. Help others understand that prophecy is not about controlling the future, but about serving it with love and humility. She is blessed, not cursed. Treat her accordingly. In faith, Pastor Robert Mackenzie." The chapel fell quiet once more, but this time the silence felt sacred rather than tense. Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing acceptance beginning to replace suspicion, curiosity overcoming fear. "So what happens now?" Thomas Bentley asked pragmatically. "How do we move forward from here?" Elena closed her eyes, seeking guidance from the gift that had caused her so much pain and was now bringing her such hope. The vision that came was clearer and more beautiful than any she had ever experienced. A future where her prophecies served the community instead of dividing it, where her gift brought people together rather than driving them apart, where she and Marcus worked side by side to build something better than what had come before. When she opened her eyes, she was smiling. "We build," she said simply. "We build trust, we build understanding, and we build a community where tomorrow's troubles become today's preparations. We build a place where gifts are celebrated instead of feared, where different kinds of faith can coexist and strengthen each other." Sheriff Dalton nodded slowly. "Sounds like a good place to start." As the men prepared to leave, each of them stopped to speak with Elena personally. Some asked forgiveness for their suspicions. Others requested guidance about troubles they sensed approaching in their own lives. All of them left the chapel changed, carrying with them a new understanding of what prophecy could mean in the hands of someone who wielded it with love rather than power. When the last footsteps faded into the night, Elena and Marcus stood alone. In the candlelit chapel, surrounded by the warmth of acceptance they had never dared hope to find. "How did you know?" Elena asked, marveling at the evening's transformation. "How did you know they would listen?" Marcus smiled, beginning to extinguish the candles one by one. "Because I listened to you first. And once someone really listens to your gift instead of their fears about it, the truth becomes impossible to deny." Elena looked around the chapel that had sheltered her in her darkest hours and would soon become something even more precious, a place where her gift could flourish and serve others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visions, new opportunities to transform prophecy from burden into blessing. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Elena Vasquez was not afraid of tomorrow, that she was eager to help shape it. Within days of the chapel confrontation, Elena's life transformed from isolation to integration, but with acceptance came new responsibilities and unexpected dangers. The morning after Sheriff Dalton's visit brought something Elena had not experienced in years. Visitors who came seeking help rather than demanding her departure. Mrs. Patterson arrived first, clutching her swollen belly and wearing an expression of desperate hope. "Miss Vasquez," she said breathlessly, "my husband heard what happened last night, about the sheriff and the others. He said maybe ... maybe you could tell me about my baby." Elena invited her inside the chapel, where morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows and jeweled patterns across the stone floor. The space felt different now, blessed by the previous evening's acceptance rather than haunted by years of rejection. "What would you like to know?" Elena asked gently, settling onto a pew beside the anxious mother. Mrs. Patterson's hands trembled as she spoke. "I lost 2 babies before this one. Both born too early, too weak to survive. The midwife says this pregnancy looks strong. But I'm so afraid. If you could see. If you could tell me whether my child will live." Elena closed her eyes, allowing her gift to guide her consciousness toward the future surrounding this woman and her unborn child. The vision that came was immediate and vivid. A healthy baby girl with her mother's auburn hair and her father's green eyes, crying lustily as she entered the world. Elena saw the child growing, taking first steps, speaking first words, bringing joy instead of sorrow to parents who had grieved too much already. "A daughter," Elena said softly, opening her eyes to meet Mrs. Patterson's tear-filled gaze. "Strong and healthy, born just before the first snow. She'll have your coloring and your husband's stubborn streak. The labor will be long but safe, and she'll grow into a child who brings laughter to your house every day." Mrs. Patterson began sobbing with relief, pressing Elena's hands between her own. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me hope." Word of Mrs. Patterson's visit spread quickly through Millbrook. By midday, 3 more families had approached the chapel, seeking guidance about their own futures. Marcus arrived to find Elena consulting with the Miller family about their farm's prospects for the coming season, her visions helping them plan crop rotations that would maximize their harvest while preserving their soil. "Looks like you're in business," Marcus observed with amusement as the Millers departed, clutching detailed notes about optimal planting schedules. Elena laughed, a sound that felt foreign after so many months of silence and sorrow. "I never imagined my gift could be practical like this. For so long, I only saw disasters and tragedies. Now I'm seeing everyday futures, successful harvests, safe journeys, favorable weather patterns." Marcus sat beside her on the chapel steps, watching townspeople go about their daily business with an energy and purpose that seemed more pronounced than before. "Maybe that's because you're finally seeing your gift through eyes of hope instead of fear. When you expect blessing, blessing is what you find." Over the following days, Elena established a routine that felt both natural and revolutionary. Each morning, she held what she privately called council sessions in the chapel, meeting with individuals and families who sought guidance about their futures. Her visions had become remarkably precise and practical, offering insights about everything from livestock health to business investments to romantic relationships. The banker, Harrison Wells, sought her advice about expanding his services to neighboring towns. Elena's visions showed him exactly which communities would prosper and which would struggle, allowing him to make investment decisions that would benefit both his institution and the families who depended on his loans. Young Sarah Mitchell came, seeking guidance about her education, torn between her desire to become a teacher and her family's expectation that she marry young. Elena's visions revealed a future where Sarah attended the new Teachers College in Pittsburgh, eventually returning to Millbrook to establish a school that would serve 3 counties and educate hundreds of children. Even Dr. Humphrey began consulting with Elena about his patients, discovering that her visions could reveal underlying health issues before symptoms appeared, allowing for early treatment that prevented serious complications. But perhaps most significantly, Elena found herself working closely with Reverend Shaw to integrate her prophetic insights into the spiritual life of the community. The Reverend had initially approached her with theological concerns, but their conversations evolved into a collaboration that enriched both their ministries. "I've been thinking about the biblical precedent for what you do," Reverend Shaw said during one of their weekly meetings. The prophets weren't fortune tellers. They were community servants who helped people understand God's will for their lives and their society. Elena nodded, grateful for his scholarly perspective. "That's exactly how my gift feels now. Not like I'm predicting fate, but like I'm helping people align their choices with God's plans for their flourishing." Marcus had become Elena's closest advisor and collaborator, helping her translate visions into practical guidance and ensuring that her counsel served the community's best interests rather than individual desires for personal gain. He had also taken on the role of protecting her from those who still viewed her gift with suspicion or who sought to exploit it for selfish purposes. That protection became necessary when strangers began arriving in Millbrook, drawn by rumors of the prophet who could see tomorrow. Some came seeking legitimate guidance, but others arrived with darker motivations. The first troubling visitor was a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Theodore Blackwood, claiming to represent wealthy investors interested in Elena's prophetic abilities. He offered substantial sums for exclusive access to her visions about commodity prices and stock market fluctuations. "Think of the good you could do with that kind of money," Blackwood argued during his uninvited visit to the chapel. "You could help so many more people if you had the resources to support your ministry properly." Elena felt an immediate sense of wrongness about the man's proposal, her gift warning her that his intentions were far from benevolent. "My visions aren't for sale, Mr. Blackwood. They're gifts meant to serve others, not to generate profit." Blackwood's friendly demeanor shifted slightly, revealing a calculating coldness beneath his polished exterior. "Miss Vasquez, you're being naive. Power like yours attracts attention whether you want it or not. Wouldn't you rather work with people who can protect your interests?" Marcus appeared in the chapel doorway at that moment, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the conversation. Without saying a word, he managed to convey that Blackwood's visit was unwelcome and should conclude promptly. "The lady has given you her answer," Marcus said calmly. "I suggest you respect it." Blackwood glanced between Elena and Marcus, clearly calculating whether to press his case further. Ultimately, he decided discretion was the better part of valor. But his parting words carried an undertone of threat. "This is a small town, Miss Vasquez. Small towns can become very isolated very quickly when the wrong people decide you're more trouble than you're worth." After Blackwood's departure, Elena found herself shaken by the encounter. For the first time since gaining the community's acceptance, she felt vulnerable again, reminded that her gift could make her a target as easily as it could make her a blessing. "There will be others like him," Marcus warned, checking the chapels windows and doors with newfound concern. "Word is spreading beyond Millbrook. People with money and power are always looking for ways to gain advantage over their competitors. Elena's visions confirmed Marcus's concerns. She began seeing strangers arriving in town with various schemes to exploit her abilities. A traveling preacher who wanted to incorporate her prophecies into a profitable religious show. A newspaper publisher seeking sensational stories about the Millbrook prophet, and most disturbingly, government officials who viewed her gift as a potential intelligence asset. The situation became more complex when Elena experienced a vision that would test her commitment to serving others above her own safety. She saw a train derailment on the Pennsylvania Railroad line, a catastrophic accident that would claim dozens of lives and occur within the month. The vision was so detailed that she could identify the exact location where a faulty track would cause a passenger train to jump the rails during a heavy rainstorm. The challenge was that preventing this disaster would require Elena to travel to the state capitol, where she would need to convince railroad officials to inspect and repair tracks based solely on her prophetic vision. Such a journey would expose her to exactly the kind of attention and exploitation she had been trying to avoid. Marcus listened gravely as Elena described both the vision and her dilemma. "How certain are you about what you've seen?" "Completely certain," Elena replied without hesitation. 73 people will die if that train derails. Families will be destroyed. Children will lose parents. I've seen their faces, heard their names, felt their terror. Then we go to Harrisburg, Marcus said simply. We find a way to make them listen. Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by his unwavering support. Marcus, if we leave Millbrook, if we expose ourselves to that kind of scrutiny, we might never be able to come home again. These people here, they're just beginning to accept my gift. If we attract the wrong kind of attention. Marcus took her hands in his calloused ones, his touch grounding her in the present moment, despite her fears about the future. Elena, your gift isn't meant to serve just one community. If God has shown you a way to save 73 lives, then that's what we're called to do, regardless of the personal cost. Elena knew he was right, but the prospect of leaving their newfound sanctuary felt overwhelming. She had just discovered what it meant to belong somewhere, to be valued and protected by a community that understood her calling. Risking that security to save strangers required a level of faith she wasn't sure she possessed. That evening, as Elena wrestled with her decision, Mrs. Patterson went into labor. The baby arrived exactly as Elena had foreseen, a healthy daughter with auburn hair and powerful lungs. But complications arose that Elena hadn't anticipated in her earlier vision, a dangerous bleeding that threatened the mother's life. Elena found herself at Mrs. Patterson's bedside, her gift suddenly expanding beyond its usual parameters. Instead of seeing distant futures, she began perceiving immediate possibilities, watching different treatment approaches play out in real time. She guided Dr. Humphrey through procedures that saved Mrs. Patterson's life, her vision showing him exactly which medicines to administer and which techniques to employ. How is this possible? Dr. Humphrey asked afterward, his hands still shaking from the intensity of the emergency. You saw things happening as they occurred, guided me through decisions I've never encountered before. Elena stared at her own hands, equally amazed by what had transpired. I think my gift is evolving, growing stronger, more immediate, more detailed, maybe because I'm finally using it the way God intended. Marcus had witnessed the entire episode, and his expression reflected both awe and concern. Elena, if your abilities are expanding like this, then the vision about the train derailment might be just the beginning. God might be preparing you for something much larger than serving one small town. Elena felt the truth of his words resonating in her soul, even as her heart rebelled against the implications. She had fought so hard to find acceptance and belonging in Millbrook. The thought of leaving behind this hard-won sanctuary to face an uncertain future filled her with dread. But as she looked down at Mrs. Patterson's newborn daughter, Sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Elena realized that her gift had never been about her own comfort or security. It had always been about serving others, about using divine insight to prevent suffering and promote flourishing. The train derailment vision returned with renewed urgency, accompanied by new details that made action even more imperative. Elena saw the exact date and time of the accident, the specific section of track that would fail, even the weather conditions that would contribute to the disaster. She also saw something else: newspaper headlines describing the catastrophe, including quotes from railroad officials who admitted they had received warnings about track safety, but had dismissed them as unreliable. In her vision, those officials spoke with deep regret about their failure to investigate claims made by some prophet girl from a backwoods town. "They're expecting us," Elena said suddenly, understanding flooding through her like revelation. Not specifically us, but someone like us. Someone claiming prophetic knowledge about the accident. They're already prepared to dismiss whatever warning we bring. Marcus frowned, considering the implications. Then we'll need more than just your vision. We'll need evidence, documentation, something that will force them to take the warning seriously. Elena closed her eyes, seeking additional guidance from her gift. The vision that came showed her a path forward that was both elegant and audacious. They wouldn't go to the railroad officials directly. Instead, they would approach the problem through someone who already had credibility and influence in exactly the circles they needed to reach. "Professor Edmund Hayes at the University of Pennsylvania," Elena said, opening her eyes with excitement. "He's conducting research on railroad safety, publishing papers about track maintenance and inspection protocols. If we can convince him to investigate our claims, his recommendations will carry weight with the railroad companies." Marcus smiled, recognizing the brilliance of the approach. A scholar's endorsement of prophetic vision. "That's either genius or madness. Maybe both," Elena admitted. "But it's our best chance to save those lives without destroying our own futures in the process." As they began planning their journey to Philadelphia, Elena felt her gift expanding once again, showing her glimpses of challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She saw herself standing before committees of serious men, her words carrying weight because of the evidence she would present. She saw Marcus beside her, his steady presence providing the strength she would need to navigate a world far more complex than anything Millbrook had prepared her for. But most importantly, she saw the train arriving safely at its destination, passengers disembarking with smiles and embraces, families reunited instead of torn apart by tragedy. The vision that had once seemed like an insurmountable burden now felt like a divine commission. Elena Vasquez was no longer just the prophet of Millbrook. She was becoming something larger, a servant of tomorrow, commissioned to prevent suffering wherever her gift revealed its approach. The journey ahead would test everything she had learned about faith, courage, and the proper use of divine gifts. But for the first time since her abilities had manifested, Elena felt ready to embrace the full scope of her calling, whatever the personal cost might be. The journey to Philadelphia would challenge everything Elena believed about her gift. But it would also reveal the true power of prophecy when wielded with wisdom and courage. Elena and Marcus departed Millbrook on a crisp October morning, their belongings packed into a single traveling case and their hearts heavy with the weight of leaving behind the first place that had ever truly accepted them. The entire town gathered at the edge of the main road to bid them farewell, a sight that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward first, removing his hat respectfully. "Miss Vasquez, I want you to know that this community will always be your home. Whatever happens in Philadelphia, whatever you encounter out there in the larger world, you'll always have a place here." Mrs. Patterson approached next, her newborn daughter bundled against the morning chill. "This child exists because of your gift," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "If saving those people on the train means you can't come back to us, At least know that your sacrifice won't be forgotten." Even Reverend Shaw offered his blessing, pressing a leather-bound Bible into Elena's hands. "Take this with you," he said. "It contains passages I've marked about the courage required to serve God's purposes, even when the path leads through dangerous territory." Dr. Humphrey provided medical supplies and detailed instructions for treating various ailments they might encounter during their travels. "Your gift saved a life here in our town," he said. "Now go save 73 more." As their hired wagon rolled away from Millbrook, Elena watched the familiar landscape fade into memory. Rolling hills gave way to denser forests, small farms yielded to larger estates, and the peaceful rhythm of rural life gradually accelerated into the bustling energy of approaching civilization. Marcus sensed her melancholy and squeezed her hand gently. "Having second thoughts?" Elena shook her head, though her expression remained troubled. "Not about saving those lives. But I keep wondering if we're naive to think one professor at a university will believe what an entire railroad company refuses to consider." "Professor Hayes isn't just any academic," Marcus reminded her. "According to the research I did before we left, he's already published 3 papers questioning current track inspection standards. He's been arguing for months that the railroads prioritize profit over safety. Our information might be exactly what he needs to prove his theories." Elena pulled her shawl tighter against the growing chill. "And if he doesn't believe us? If he dismisses us as rural superstitionists chasing fantasies?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Then we find another way. Your gift has never led us astray yet, Elena. I have to believe it won't start now." The journey to Philadelphia took 3 days, with overnight stops in increasingly larger towns that exposed Elena to a world far more complex than anything she had experienced in Millbrook. In Lancaster, she witnessed her first industrial factory, its smokestacks belching dark clouds that seemed to stain the very air. In Reading, she observed the sharp divide between wealthy merchants in fine clothes and immigrant workers, whose faces bore the exhaustion of endless labor. Most disturbing were the visions that came unbidden as they traveled. Elena found herself seeing futures for strangers they passed on the road. A merchant whose business would fail due to embezzlement by his trusted partner. A young mother whose husband would die in a mining accident before their son learned to walk. A family of farmers whose crops would be destroyed by an unseasonable frost. "There's so much suffering coming," Elena whispered to Marcus as they passed through a small mining town. "So many tragedies I can see but can't prevent. How do I choose which futures to try to change?" Marcus guided their wagon around a particularly deep rut in the road. "Maybe that's not your choice to make. Maybe your gift shows you these things so you can understand the scope of human suffering, so you can appreciate the significance of the lives you are able to save." Elena found wisdom in his words, but the weight of witnessing so much future sorrow still pressed heavily on her spirit. By the time they reached the outskirts of Philadelphia, she felt emotionally drained from processing countless visions of strangers' troubles. Philadelphia itself overwhelmed Elena's senses immediately. The city teemed with more people than she had ever seen in one place, their voices creating a constant din of conversation, argument, commerce, and celebration. Horse-drawn carriages competed for space with pedestrians on cobblestone streets that stretched further than her eyes could follow. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, their windows glowing with gaslight even in daylight. "How do we find one professor in all of this?" Elena asked, staring at the urban maze surrounding them. Marcus consulted the directions he had obtained from a postal clerk. "University of Pennsylvania is in West Philadelphia. We'll need to cross the Schuylkill River, then ask for specific directions to the engineering department." Finding Professor Hayes proved easier than expected, though convincing him to grant them an audience required more creativity. Marcus presented himself as a rural surveyor interested in railroad safety, while Elena remained in the background, observing and listening. The professor proved to be a thin, intense man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that burned with intellectual passion. "Railroad safety is indeed my area of expertise," Professor Hayes said, settling behind his cluttered desk. "Though I must warn you, Mr. Thompson, that my views on current industry practices are quite unpopular with the companies themselves." Marcus nodded gravely. "That's exactly why we've come to you, Professor. We have information about a specific safety issue that we believe requires immediate attention, but we need someone with your credibility to present it to the proper authorities." Professor Hayes leaned forward, intrigued. "What sort of information?" Marcus glanced at Elena, who took a deep breath before stepping into the conversation. "Professor, what I'm about to tell you will sound incredible, but I ask you to hear me completely before making any judgments." Over the next hour, Elena explained her prophetic gift, described the vision of the train derailment, and provided every detail she had seen about the location, timing, and cause of the accident. She spoke with quiet conviction, neither embellishing nor minimizing the extraordinary nature of her claims. Professor Hayes listened with growing fascination, occasionally interrupting to ask for clarification about technical details. When Elena finished her account, he sat in silence for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the implications of what he had heard. "Miss Vasquez," he said finally, "what you're describing flies in the face of everything I understand about the natural world. And yet, the technical specifics you've provided about track failure mechanisms are remarkably sophisticated for someone without engineering training." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I understand your skepticism, Professor. But I'm not asking you to believe in my gift. I'm asking you to investigate the track section I've described. If you find the structural weaknesses I've seen, then the source of that information becomes less important than acting on it." Professor Hayes stood and walked to a large map of Pennsylvania railroad lines mounted on his office wall. "Show me exactly where you believe this accident will occur." Elena approached the map, studying the network of lines until she found the section from her vision. "Here," she said, pointing to a specific segment between Harrisburg and Philadelphia. "Mile marker 127, where the track curves around Beacon Hill. The eastern rail has developed stress fractures that aren't visible from casual inspection, but they'll fail completely when the next heavy rain softens the embankment." Professor Hayes traced the route with his finger, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "That section was rebuilt just 2 years ago after flooding damaged the original roadbed. If corners were cut during reconstruction, you could verify this." Marcus interjected, "Send an inspection team to examine that specific area. If Miss Vasquez is wrong, you've lost nothing but a day's work. If she's right, then I have the evidence I need to force a complete review of reconstruction standards across the entire system," Professor Hayes finished. "And more immediately, I have justification to demand emergency repairs before the next major storm." Elena felt a surge of hope as she watched the professor's academic skepticism transform into scientific curiosity. "Will you help us, Professor?" Professor Hayes returned to his desk and began writing rapidly on a sheet of official university letterhead. "I'm drafting a letter to the Pennsylvania Railroad's chief engineer, requesting an immediate safety inspection of the Beacon Hill section. My recommendations have been ignored before, but if I frame this as urgent research related to my published work on embankment stability, will they listen?" Marcus asked. "They'll have to," Professor Hayes replied with grim satisfaction. "The university has significant influence with state transportation officials. If I present this as a formal engineering concern backed by my research, they can't simply dismiss it without risking public scrutiny." Elena watched the professor work, feeling the strange sensation of watching her vision begin to transform into reality. But even as hope grew in her heart, new concerns arose in her mind. "Professor," she said hesitantly, What happens if the inspection confirms my vision? What happens to me when word spreads that a prophetic warning prevented a major disaster? Professor Hayes paused in his writing, recognizing the gravity of her question. That's a legitimate concern, Miss Vasquez. Success in this endeavor will almost certainly attract unwanted attention to your abilities. She's already dealing with people who want to exploit her gift, Marcus added. If this becomes public knowledge, the pressure will intensify dramatically. Professor. Hayes set down his pen and regarded Elena with new understanding. Then we ensure it doesn't become public knowledge. My letter will reference reliable intelligence about potential structural problems without mentioning the source. If the inspection reveals issues, I'll claim credit for identifying them through my research methodology. Elena stared at him in amazement. You would do that? You would sacrifice recognition for a major discovery to protect my identity? Miss Vasquez, Professor Hayes said seriously, if you possess the ability you claim, then you represent something far more valuable than one that prevented disaster. You represent the possibility of preventing countless future tragedies. Protecting that resource is more important than any personal recognition. The professor's letter was dispatched that same afternoon, marked urgent and delivered by university courier. Elena and Marcus found lodging at a modest inn near the campus, where they waited anxiously for word about the inspection results. 2 days later, Professor Hayes summoned them back to his office, his face bearing an expression of stunned amazement. The inspection confirmed everything, he announced without preamble. Stress fractures exactly where you described them. Embankment instability precisely as you predicted. Even evidence of substandard materials used during reconstruction. The chief engineer has ordered immediate repairs and a complete review of all recently rebuilt sections. Elena felt her knees weaken with relief. The train ... the passengers will arrive safely at their destination, Professor Hayes confirmed. The repairs are already underway, and emergency speed restrictions have been implemented for that entire route until work is completed. Marcus stepped forward, clasping the professor's hand gratefully. Professor, you've saved 73 lives today. No, Professor Hayes replied, looking directly at Elena. Miss Vasquez saved those lives. I simply provided the mechanism for translating her vision into action. Elena sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. 73 strangers would live because she had found the courage to leave her sanctuary and trust her gift to guide her toward those who could help. But Professor Hayes wasn't finished with his revelations. There's something else, he said, settling behind his desk with obvious excitement. The railroad investigation has uncovered a pattern of cost-cutting and corner-cutting that goes far beyond the Beacon Hill section. Your warning has initiated a comprehensive safety review that will likely prevent dozens of potential accidents over the coming years. Elena looked up at him in wonder. My vision showed one disaster. Are you saying we've prevented many more? Precisely, Professor Hayes confirmed. Sometimes preventing one tragedy creates a cascade of prevention that extends far beyond the initial intervention. Your gift may have saved hundreds of lives, not just 73. Marcus squeezed Elena's hand, his eyes bright with pride and amazement. Elena, do you understand what this means? Your gift isn't just about seeing individual futures. It's about seeing how changing one future can transform many others. Elena felt her understanding of her abilities expanding once again. But this time the expansion brought excitement rather than fear. She was beginning to comprehend the true scope of prophetic responsibility, not just to warn of coming dangers, but to identify the leverage points where small actions could prevent cascading disasters. Professor, she said slowly, what if this is just the beginning? What if God has given me this gift not just to help one small town, but to serve a much larger purpose? Professor Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a scientist observing a fascinating phenomenon. Miss Vasquez, if that's truly the case, then we need to discuss how to develop and deploy your abilities more systematically. The world is full of preventable tragedies, if only someone could see them coming. Elena felt a new vision beginning to form, not of disaster this time, but of possibility. She saw herself working with scholars and officials, her prophetic insights providing early warning of everything from natural disasters to political crises. She saw a network of believers and supporters helping her translate divine revelation into practical action. Most importantly, she saw Marcus beside her through it all, his faith in her gift providing the foundation upon which she could build a ministry that would serve not just Millbrook, but the entire nation. Professor, Elena said with growing conviction, I think it's time to discuss what comes next. The woman who had once cowered in an abandoned chapel, terrified of her own visions, was ready to embrace a calling that would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But she was no longer facing that challenge alone. She had Marcus, whose faith in her had transformed curse into blessing. She had Professor Hayes, whose scholarly credibility could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. And most importantly, she had a growing understanding of how her gift could serve purposes far greater than she had ever dared to dream. The train that would arrive safely at its destination was just the beginning. Elena Vasquez was about to discover what it truly meant to be a prophet in a world desperate for hope. Elena's success in Philadelphia opened doors to a larger world, but with greater influence came more dangerous enemies and tests that would challenge her faith to its very core. Weeks following the railroad incident transformed Elena's life in ways she had never anticipated. Professor Hayes's academic connections spread word of her abilities through carefully crafted networks of scholars, government officials, and progressive thinkers who viewed prophetic insight as a valuable resource rather than supernatural threat. Within a month, Elena found herself established in a small but comfortable apartment near the university, funded by benefactors who remained anonymous, but whose influence opened doors throughout Pennsylvania's corridors of power. Marcus had secured work with a construction company rebuilding parts of Philadelphia damaged by recent flooding, his carpentry skills proving valuable in the rapidly expanding city. But his primary role remained supporting Elena as she navigated the complexities of serving clients whose problems extended far beyond the personal concerns that had defined her ministry in Millbrook. Elena's new consultations dealt with matters of regional and national significance. State legislators sought her insights about proposed infrastructure projects, warning her when political corruption might undermine public safety. Military officials discreetly requested guidance about territorial disputes that could escalate into armed conflicts. Even federal postal inspectors consulted her about mail routes that might be vulnerable to robbery or natural disasters. The most challenging aspect of this expanded ministry was learning to distinguish between visions that served the public good and those that might benefit only powerful individuals seeking personal advantage. Elena developed strict ethical guidelines, refusing to provide information that could be used for financial speculation or political manipulation. She focused exclusively on preventing suffering and promoting common welfare, a stance that earned respect from some quarters while generating hostility from others. The hostility became apparent when Elena began receiving threatening letters from individuals who viewed her growing influence as dangerous to their own interests. Railroad barons whose safety violations she had exposed sent thinly veiled warnings about the consequences of interfering with legitimate business operations. Political figures whose corruption she had revealed through prophetic visions hired private investigators to dig into her background, seeking ammunition to discredit her testimony. Most disturbing were the religious leaders who denounced her from pulpits across the region, claiming that her gifts represented demonic deception designed to lead faithful Christians astray. These attacks carried particular sting because they echoed Elena's own early fears about the source of her abilities. forcing her to repeatedly examine her conscience and seek confirmation that her gift truly came from God. Marcus proved invaluable during these periods of doubt and external pressure. His unwavering faith in Elena's calling provided emotional stability when criticism threatened to overwhelm her confidence. More practically, his protective instincts and careful attention to security helped shield her from those who might seek to harm or intimidate her. "You're changing the world," Marcus reminded Elena during one particularly difficult evening when hostile newspaper editorials had questioned both her sanity and her motives. "People who benefit from the current system don't want it changed, so they attack anyone who threatens their advantages." Elena sat by their apartment window, watching gas lamps flicker to life across the city as darkness settled over Philadelphia. "Sometimes I wonder if we should return to Millbrook. Life was simpler there, more peaceful. These political battles, these accusations and threats. Is preventing disasters worth creating so much controversy?" Marcus joined her at the window, his presence immediately calming her agitated spirit. "Elena, 3 weeks ago, your vision prevented a factory fire that would have killed 47 workers. Last month, your warning helped authorities arrest a gang planning to rob mail trains across 4 counties. Just yesterday, your insights allowed city officials to prepare for flooding that could have displaced thousands of families. How is that not worth any amount of controversy?" Elena leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steady conviction. "I know you're right. It's just ... I never imagined that serving God would require engaging with so much worldly power and politics. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing the purity of purpose I had when I was just trying to help individual families in a small town." "Maybe the purity was never about the simplicity," Marcus suggested gently. "Maybe it was always about the motive." "You're still helping people, Elena. The scale has changed, but the heart remains the same." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at their apartment door. Marcus answered cautiously, finding Professor Hayes standing in the hallway with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Elena," the professor said without preamble, "I've just received word from Washington. Federal officials want to consult with you about a matter of national security. This could be the opportunity we've been hoping for to establish your gifts as a legitimate resource for preventing large-scale disasters." Elena felt her heart begin racing. What kind of national security matter? Professor Hayes glanced around nervously before stepping inside their apartment. "There are concerns about potential conflicts with Mexico over territorial boundaries. Military officials believe your insights could help them identify flashpoints before they explode into open warfare." Elena exchanged a long look with Marcus, both of them recognizing the magnitude of what Professor Hayes was suggesting. Consulting with federal officials about military matters would elevate Elena's role far beyond anything they had previously imagined, but it would also expose her to scrutiny and pressure at levels that could prove overwhelming. "What exactly would they want from me?" Elena asked carefully. "Intelligence about troop movements, predictions about where border incidents might occur, insights about which diplomatic approaches might succeed or fail," Professor Hayes explained. "The kind of information that could prevent a war that would cost thousands of lives and enormous resources." Elena closed her eyes, seeking guidance from her gift about this unprecedented opportunity. The visions that came were complex and troubling. She saw herself in rooms filled with uniformed men, making decisions about life and death, her prophecies influencing strategies that would affect entire populations. She saw the good that could result from preventing unnecessary conflicts, but she also saw the corrupting influence of power and the danger of becoming a tool for military ambitions rather than a servant of divine will. "There's something else," Professor Hayes continued. "The federal officials have specifically requested that you come to Washington alone. They're concerned about security, about ensuring that sensitive information doesn't reach unauthorized individuals." Marcus stiffened immediately. Absolutely not. Elena doesn't go anywhere without me, especially not to meetings with people we don't know and can't trust. Elena felt a chill of premonition, her gift warning her that this request represented a cruelty test whose outcome would determine the entire trajectory of her future ministry. Professor, what happens if I refuse to go alone? Professor Hayes shifted uncomfortably. They've indicated that your cooperation in this matter would significantly influence their willingness to support your work in other areas. Federal backing could open doors for you across the entire nation, Elena, but it requires demonstrating that you can be trusted with matters of utmost sensitivity. Elena understood the implicit threat behind the professor's diplomatic language. The federal officials weren't simply requesting her assistance. They were attempting to establish control over her activities. Compliance would bring resources and protection, but it would also mean sacrificing the independence that had allowed her to serve according to her conscience rather than political expedience. I need time to consider this, Elena said finally. Can you arrange a delay of a few days while I pray about the decision? Professor Hayes nodded, though his expression suggested he understood the gravity of Elena's hesitation. I'll communicate your request, but I should warn you that these officials aren't accustomed to waiting for answers. They may interpret delay as reluctance to cooperate. After the professor departed, Elena and Marcus spent the evening discussing the implications of the federal government's interest in her abilities. Both recognized that they had reached a crucial decision point that would shape everything that followed. What does your gift tell you about this opportunity? Marcus asked. As they prepared for bed, Elena had been wrestling with that question all evening, seeking clarity through prayer and meditation. I see paths branching in different directions. If I go to Washington and cooperate with their demands, I gain access to information and resources that could prevent enormous suffering. But I also see myself becoming increasingly isolated from the communities I originally served, surrounded by people who view my gift as a weapon rather than a blessing. And if you refuse? If I refuse, I maintain my independence and integrity, but I lose the opportunity to prevent larger disasters. People die who might have lived if I had access to federal intelligence networks and military planning sessions. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the competing demands of protecting Elena and supporting her calling to serve others. What would happen if we tried a third approach? What if you agreed to consult with federal officials, but only under conditions that preserve your independence? Elena looked at him with sudden hope. What kind of conditions? You attend meetings with me present as your advisor and protector. You provide insights about preventing disasters, but you refuse to participate in planning military operations or political strategies. You maintain the right to withdraw your cooperation if your gift is misused, or if you're pressured to act against your conscience. Elena felt her gift responding to Marcus's suggestion with images of possibility rather than foreboding. She saw herself working with government officials in a relationship of mutual respect rather than subordination. Her prophetic insights valued but not exploited. It's worth attempting, she agreed. But if they refuse those conditions, we'll know their true intentions. The next morning, Elena sent word to Professor Hayes outlining her terms for cooperating with the federal consultation. The response arrived within hours. The officials would accept her conditions for an initial meeting, but they reserved the right to modify the arrangement based on the results of that consultation. Elena recognized the compromise inherent in their response, but she felt peace about moving forward with the meeting. Her gift had shown her that this encounter would serve purposes beyond what any of the participants currently understood. 3 days later, Elena and Marcus boarded a train bound for Washington, D.C., carrying with them letters of introduction from Professor Hayes and recommendations from several Pennsylvania state officials. Elena had prepared extensively for the meeting, studying maps of the disputed territorial regions and praying for wisdom. about how to use her gift in service of peace rather than warfare. The federal capital overwhelmed Elena even more than Philadelphia had. The buildings seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome, their imposing facades and formal gardens suggesting power that demanded submission rather than cooperation. The streets teemed with men in expensive suits conducting business with an intensity that felt almost predatory. Their meeting was scheduled at a nondescript government building near the War Department, in a conference room that contained nothing but a large table, wooden chairs, and detailed maps of the southwestern territories. Elena felt an immediate sense of unease about the sterile environment, so different from the warm, personal spaces where she had previously conducted her consultations. The federal officials proved to be exactly what Elena had expected: professional, courteous, and utterly focused on extracting useful information from her abilities. Colonel Morrison introduced himself as the liaison between civilian prophetic resources and military planning operations, a title that made Elena's skin crawl with its implications. Secretary Williams represented diplomatic interests, while Mr. Hartwell claimed to speak for unspecified national security concerns. "Miss Vasquez," Colonel Morrison began without preamble, "we've reviewed your record of successful predictions and interventions. Your abilities represent a potentially invaluable resource for preventing conflicts that could cost our nation dearly in both blood and treasure." Elena maintained her composure despite feeling like a specimen being examined by scientists. "Gentlemen, I'm honored by your confidence in my abilities, but I want to be clear about my limitations and conditions. My gift shows me ways to prevent suffering and promote peace. I cannot and will not use it to gain military advantages or to harm others." Secretary Williams leaned forward with obvious interest. "Miss Vasquez, surely you understand that preventing American casualties sometimes requires accepting that others may suffer instead. War is a complex moral calculation that extends beyond simple pacifist principles." Elena felt her gift stirring with warning images. She saw these men attempting to manipulate her visions to justify predetermined military actions, using her prophetic authority to legitimize decisions they had already made for political reasons. "Secretary Williams," Elena replied carefully, "my understanding of divine will is that it never involves choosing which lives are more valuable than others. If my gift can prevent suffering for any people, regardless of their nationality, then that's how it should be used." Mr. Hartwell interrupted with barely concealed impatience. "Miss Vasquez, we appreciate your moral sensibilities, but we're dealing with practical realities of national defense. Are you willing to provide the insights we've requested, or should we seek assistance elsewhere?" Elena exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, drawing strength from his supportive presence. She closed her eyes and allowed her gift to show her the futures that surrounded this moment and these decisions. The visions that came were startling in their complexity and scope. She saw potential conflicts prevented through diplomatic solutions that her insights could facilitate. But she also saw her prophetic authority being used to justify aggressive actions that would create more suffering than they prevented. Most disturbing, she saw herself becoming isolated from the very communities her gift was meant to serve, transformed into a tool of state power rather than an instrument of divine compassion. When Elena opened her eyes, her decision was clear. "Gentlemen," she said with quiet conviction, "I'm willing to share insights that could prevent conflicts and save lives. But I cannot provide information that would be used to plan attacks or to gain advantages over others. If you're interested in preventing war rather than winning it, then we can work together. If your primary goal is military or political advantage, then I'm afraid we have nothing to discuss." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Elena could see the officials exchanging glances, clearly debating whether to accept her conditions or to seek more compliant prophetic resources elsewhere. Finally, Colonel Morrison spoke with obvious reluctance. Miss Vasquez, your terms are unconventional, but given the potential value of your abilities, we're willing to proceed under your conditions for this initial consultation. However, I should warn you that the nature of national security sometimes requires difficult choices that may conflict with your idealistic preferences. Elena nodded, understanding that this was likely the best compromise she could achieve. I appreciate your willingness to accommodate my concerns, Colonel. Now, how can my gift serve the cause of peace? Over the following hours, Elena provided insights about potential flashpoints along the Mexican border, diplomatic approaches that might succeed in resolving territorial disputes, and warning signs that could indicate when negotiations were likely to fail. Her visions revealed information that amazed the federal officials, demonstrating knowledge of regional politics and military logistics that no civilian should have possessed. But Elena was careful to frame every insight in terms of preventing conflict rather than achieving victory. When her visions showed Mexican troop movements, she emphasized the defensive nature of their positioning rather than their vulnerability to attack. When she saw potential diplomatic breakthroughs, she stressed the mutual benefits that could result from peaceful resolution rather than the advantages America might gain. By the end of the day, Elena had provided enough valuable information to convince the officials of her abilities while maintaining her ethical boundaries. The federal representatives agreed to follow up with specific requests for guidance about diplomatic initiatives, while Elena reserved the right to decline any consultation that might promote conflict rather than prevent it. As Elena and Marcus departed the government building, both felt that they had navigated a crucial test successfully. Elena had demonstrated that her gift could serve national interests without compromising her moral integrity, while the federal officials had gained access to prophetic insights that could help them pursue peaceful solutions to complex problems. Elena's gift warned her that this initial success was only the beginning of a much more challenging journey. The visions that came as they walked through Washington streets showed her standing at the center of debates that would shape the nation's future, her prophecies influencing decisions that would affect millions of lives. The woman who had once hidden in an abandoned chapel, terrified of her own visions, was about to discover what it truly meant to bear prophetic responsibility on a national scale. The tests ahead would challenge not just her abilities, but her faith, her relationships, and her understanding of how divine gifts should be wielded in a world where power and politics often overwhelmed moral considerations. But Elena was no longer facing these challenges alone. She had Marcus, whose love and faith provided an unshakable foundation for her calling. She had allies like Professor Hayes, who understood the value of prophetic insight when properly applied. And most importantly, she had a growing understanding of how her gift could serve purposes far greater than personal comfort or safety. The future that stretched ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but it was also filled with unprecedented opportunities to prevent suffering and promote peace on a scale she had never imagined possible. Elena Vasquez was ready to embrace whatever tests awaited her, trusting that the same divine source that had given her visions would also provide the wisdom and strength needed to use them wisely. Years later, Elena would realize that her greatest test wasn't convincing skeptics to believe in her gift, but learning when prophecy required action and when it demanded the courage to remain silent. The months following Elena's Washington consultation brought both validation and unexpected challenges. Word of her successful cooperation with federal officials spread through networks of influence she had never known existed, leading to requests from governors, mayors, and business leaders across the nation. Elena found herself at the center of a growing movement that viewed prophetic insight as a legitimate tool for social progress and disaster prevention. But with recognition came a temptation she had never anticipated: the seductive appeal of power wielded for seemingly righteous purposes. The temptation crystallized when Governor Bradford of New York invited Elena to Albany to to consult about a massive public works project that would reshape the Hudson River Valley. The governor's proposal involved damming several tributaries to create reservoirs that would supply fresh water to New York City while generating electricity for the entire region. Engineers projected the scheme would improve millions of lives while creating thousands of jobs during construction. Elena's initial visions about the project showed exactly what the governor wanted to see: successful completion of the dams, abundant, clean water flowing to the city, prosperous communities sprouting around the new reservoirs. But when she attempted to look deeper into the project's long-term consequences, her gift revealed troubling details that the engineers had either missed or deliberately ignored. She saw entire ecosystems destroyed by the altered water flow, farming, communities displaced when their ancestral lands disappeared beneath artificial lakes, and indigenous tribes whose sacred sites would be permanently submerged. Most disturbing, she witnessed a catastrophic dam failure 20 years in the future, when poor maintenance and unprecedented rainfall would combine to create a flood that would devastate everything downstream. "Governor Bradford," Elena said carefully during their consultation, "while your project shows promise for addressing New York City's immediate needs, I must warn you about several long-term consequences that could prove catastrophic." The governor, a portly man whose political ambitions were barely concealed behind his public service rhetoric, leaned forward with obvious concern. "What sort of consequences, Miss Vasquez?" Elena described her visions of environmental destruction and eventual dam failure, providing specific details about vulnerable construction points and inadequate safety margins. She explained how the displaced communities would suffer generations of poverty and resentment, creating social instability that would undermine the very prosperity the project was designed to create. Governor Bradford listened with growing impatience, his expression shifting from concern to irritation as Elena's warnings threatened to derail his signature initiative. "Miss Vasquez," he said finally, "I appreciate your insights, but you must understand that progress requires difficult choices. We cannot allow concern for a few displaced farmers to prevent improvements that will benefit millions of urban residents." Elena felt her gift stirring with new visions, showing her the governor's true motivations: political advancement, financial kickbacks from construction companies, and a callous disregard for anyone whose suffering might be inconvenient to his ambitions. "Governor," Elena replied with growing conviction, "my gift doesn't show me political calculations or economic projections. It shows me human consequences. The dam failure I've seen will kill over 300 people, including children in the valley schools. How do you weigh that against the political benefits of completing this project?" The tension in the room became palpable as Governor Bradford realized that Elena would not provide the prophetic endorsement he had expected to use in promoting his controversial proposal. "Miss Vasquez," he said coldly, "perhaps your abilities are better suited to smaller, simpler problems. State-level governance requires a more sophisticated understanding of competing interests and necessary compromises." Elena recognized the dismissal for what it was, but she also understood that she had passed a crucial test. By refusing to allow her gift to be used for questionable purposes, even when enormous pressure was applied, she had demonstrated the kind of integrity that would define her ministry for years to come. Marcus had waited outside during the consultation, but he immediately sensed Elena's emotional state when she emerged from the governor's office. "I take it the meeting didn't go as the governor hoped?" he asked as they walked through Albany's government district. Elena nodded, feeling both relief and sadness about the encounter. "He wanted me to validate a project that would cause enormous suffering in order to serve his political ambitions. When I refused, he made it clear that my services were no longer welcome. How do you feel about that?" Elena considered the question. As they paused beside the Hudson River, watching cargo boats navigate the current that would soon be altered by dams if the governor proceeded with his plans despite her warnings. "Grateful," she said finally. Grateful that my gift gave me the strength to speak the truth, even when it was unwelcome. For so long, I was terrified that people wouldn't believe my visions. Now I realize the real challenge is having the courage to share visions that people don't want to believe. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young woman who had been observing their exchange from a respectful distance. She appeared to be in her early 20s, well-dressed but not ostentatious, with intelligent eyes and an expression of nervous determination. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, "are you Elena Vasquez? The prophet who prevented the railroad disaster in Pennsylvania?" Elena nodded cautiously, unsure whether the stranger represented another opportunity for service or a potential threat to their safety. "My name is Catherine Morrison," the woman continued. "I'm a journalist with the Albany Herald, and I've been following your work for several months. I was hoping to speak with you about the governor's dam project." Elena exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, both of them recognizing the potential implications of speaking with a newspaper reporter about their consultation with state officials. "Miss Morrison," Elena said carefully, "I'm not sure what you've heard about my meeting with Governor Bradford, but I cannot discuss the details of private consultations." Catherine Morrison smiled with obvious respect for Elena's discretion. "I'm not asking you to reveal confidential information, Miss Vasquez, but I am investigating concerns about the dam project that parallel some of the issues you might have encountered. Would you be willing to discuss your general approach to evaluating large-scale infrastructure projects?" Elena found herself intrigued by the journalist's careful phrasing and evident intelligence. "What sort of concerns are you investigating?" "Environmental impact assessments that seem incomplete, displacement of communities without adequate compensation plans, and engineering reports that may have been altered to minimize projected risks," Catherine Morrison replied. "Several independent experts have raised questions about the project's safety and sustainability, but their concerns have been dismissed or suppressed." Elena felt her gift responding to the journalist's words with confirmatory visions. She saw evidence hidden in government files, saw scientists pressured to modify their recommendations, saw community leaders threatened with legal action if they continued opposing the project. "Miss Morrison," Elena said with growing conviction, "I believe your investigation serves an important public purpose. While I cannot discuss specific consultations, I can share my general observations about the importance of considering long-term consequences in major infrastructure decisions." Over the following hour, Elena provided Catherine Morrison with insights about the patterns her gift had revealed in various development projects, the tendency to prioritize short-term benefits over long-term costs, the systematic exclusion of affected communities from decision-making processes, and the dangerous practice of minimizing environmental and safety concerns to expedite approval processes. Elena was careful never to reference her specific visions about the dam project, but her general observations provided Catherine Morrison with exactly the framework she needed to present her investigative findings in terms that would resonate with public concerns about governmental accountability. "Miss Vasquez," Catherine Morrison said as their conversation concluded, "your insights have helped me understand patterns that I sensed but couldn't articulate. If my investigation succeeds in bringing these issues to public attention, it will be partly because you helped me see the larger picture." Elena felt a warm satisfaction about the encounter, recognizing that her gift had found another avenue for serving the public good. By refusing to endorse Governor Bradford's questionable project and then providing a journalist with perspective that could expose its flaws, she had demonstrated how prophetic insight could serve truth and justice. Even when political power opposed both, the impact of Catherine Morrison's investigation exceeded everyone's expectations. Her series of articles about the Hudson River Dam project revealed systematic corruption, environmental negligence, and disregard for public safety that extended far beyond the specific proposal Governor Bradford had championed. Federal investigators launched inquiries that ultimately led to criminal charges, against several state officials and construction company executives. More importantly for Elena, the investigation established her reputation as someone whose prophetic insights could be trusted to serve public welfare rather than private interests. Requests for her consultation began arriving from reform-minded officials, environmental organizations, and community groups seeking to prevent disasters before they occurred. Elena's ministry evolved into something unprecedented in American society. A prophetic voice that commanded respect across political and religious boundaries because of its consistent commitment to truth and human welfare. She established offices in both Philadelphia and Washington, staffed by assistants who helped coordinate her consultations while protecting her from exploitation by those who sought to misuse her abilities. Marcus became her chief advisor and protector, developing expertise in the legal and political complexities that surrounded Elena's work. His carpenter's practical wisdom proved invaluable in translating prophetic visions into actionable recommendations that could be implemented by government agencies and private organizations. Professor Hayes evolved into Elena's academic liaison, helping her develop systematic approaches to documenting and verifying her prophecies. His scholarly credibility provided intellectual legitimacy that complemented Elena's spiritual authority, creating a combination that proved remarkably effective in promoting prophetic insight as a valid tool for social planning. But Elena's greatest test came not from external opponents, but from an internal crisis that threatened to destroy everything she had built. The crisis began with a vision, unlike any Elena had ever experienced. Instead of seeing specific future events, she found herself witnessing broad patterns of historical change that stretched decades into the future. She saw a great civil war tearing the nation apart, brother fighting against brother over questions of slavery and federal authority. She witnessed cities burning, families destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of young men dying in battles that would reshape the American character forever. The vision was so overwhelming in its scope and horror that Elena collapsed during her morning prayers, remaining unconscious for nearly an entire day. When she finally awakened, she found Marcus and Dr. Humphrey attending her with expressions of deep concern. "Elena," Marcus said gently, "you've been unconscious for 18 hours. We were beginning to fear that something had happened to your gift, or to your mind." Elena struggled to sit up, her head still spinning from the magnitude of what she had seen. "Marcus, I've witnessed something terrible. A war that will dwarf any conflict our nation has ever experienced. Slavery will tear us apart, and the healing will take generations." Dr. Humphrey leaned forward with professional interest. "Miss Vasquez, can you describe the physical sensations you experienced during this vision? The duration and intensity suggest something far beyond your usual prophetic episodes." Elena described the overwhelming nature of the historical vision, its difference from her typical glimpses of specific future events. As she spoke, she realized that her gift had evolved, once again, expanding from individual and community concerns to encompass national and historical patterns. "The question," Elena said slowly, "is what I'm supposed to do with this knowledge. How do you warn a nation about a war that seems inevitable? How do you prepare people for suffering that appears necessary for moral progress?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of Elena's vision. "Elena, maybe the purpose isn't to prevent this war, but to help minimize its costs. If conflict is inevitable, perhaps your gift can help identify ways to shorten it, to reduce casualties, to prepare for healing afterward." Elena felt the wisdom in Marcus's suggestion, but she also felt the crushing weight of responsibility that came with foreseeing such monumental suffering. "Marcus, if I'm right about what's coming, then millions of lives hang in the balance. How do I carry that burden without losing my sanity or my faith?" Dr. Humphrey interjected with surprising gentleness. "Miss Vasquez, perhaps the burden isn't meant to be carried alone. You've built a network of allies and supporters who share your commitment to using prophetic insight for good. Maybe it's time to trust them with these larger visions, to seek their wisdom about how to respond to what you've seen. Elena spent the following weeks in intensive consultation with her closest advisors, sharing details of her historical vision and seeking guidance about how to respond appropriately. Professor Hayes provided historical context that helped frame the vision within patterns of social change that had occurred in other nations. Catherine Morrison, who had become a trusted friend and ally, offered insights about how prophetic warnings might be communicated to the public without causing panic or despair. Most importantly, Reverend Shaw traveled from Millbrook to provide spiritual counsel about Elena's expanding calling. The elderly minister had become one of her most valued advisors, his theological wisdom helping her understand how biblical prophets had handled similar burdens. "Elena," Reverend Shaw said during one of their long conversations, "the great prophets of Scripture often saw terrible futures that could not be prevented, only endured with faith. Their role wasn't always to change what was coming, but to help people understand why it was necessary and how to maintain hope during the darkness." Elena found profound comfort in the Reverend's perspective, but she also felt called to use her expanded gift more actively than passive acceptance would allow. Over time, she developed an approach that balanced prophetic warning with practical preparation. She began consulting with anti-slavery organizations about strategies that might reduce the violence of coming conflicts, advised government officials about policies that could address underlying tensions before they exploded into warfare, and worked with medical organizations to prepare for the massive casualties that her vision showed would overwhelm existing hospital systems. Elena's ministry during the pre-war period established new precedents for how prophetic insight could serve society during times of approaching crisis. Rather than simply predicting disasters, she became an advocate for preparation and mitigation, using her visions to identify opportunities for reducing suffering even when the suffering itself could not be prevented. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it was also deeply meaningful. Elena had evolved from a frightened young woman hiding in an abandoned chapel to a national figure whose voice carried weight in the highest councils of government and society. Her journey from curse to calling was complete, but her service to others would continue for decades to come. Years later, as Elena sat in her comfortable study overlooking the Potomac River, she reflected on the path that had brought her from Millbrook Cemetery to the center of American political and social life. Marcus worked in his adjoining office, now serving as director of the Institute for Prophetic Studies they had founded together. Their marriage had been blessed with children who showed signs of inheriting Elena's gift, raising new questions about how prophetic abilities should be nurtured and trained. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged. From that night when Marcus had first entered the abandoned chapel, prophecy was not about controlling the future, but about serving it with love, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to human welfare. Elena's gift had transformed from a source of isolation and fear into an instrument of hope and healing that would continue blessing others. Long after her own voice fell silent, the woman who had once been feared for her prophecies had become beloved for her wisdom, respected for her integrity, and trusted with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible during those dark days beside her mother's grave. Her tomorrow had indeed been worth believing in, and countless others had been blessed because one faithful man had possessed the courage to say so when it mattered most. But Elena's greatest revelations were yet to come, arriving during the final phase of her ministry when age and experience had refined her gift into something approaching divine clarity. The revelation began on a quiet spring morning in 1859, when Elena was approaching her 40th birthday. She had been consulting with a delegation of Southern ministers who sought her guidance about rising tensions in their communities. These were good men, genuinely concerned about preventing violence, but trapped within social systems they had inherited rather than chosen. Reverend Matthews from Charleston spoke with obvious anguish about his congregation's growing militancy. Miss Vasquez, my parishioners speak increasingly of war as God's will, of slavery as divinely ordained. How do I guide them toward peace when they believe conflict serves righteousness? Elena closed her eyes, seeking wisdom for a question that had plagued her for years. But instead of seeing specific guidance for the Reverend's dilemma, she found herself witnessing something far more profound: the spiritual architecture underlying all human conflict, the ways divine will work through even the most tragic circumstances to accomplish purposes beyond mortal understanding. She saw slavery not as an institution that would simply end, but as a moral test that would forge a new national character through suffering. She witnessed the war's devastating battles not as senseless slaughter, but as the birth pangs of a more perfect union. She observed the decades of reconstruction following conflict not as failure to heal, but as the slow, difficult work of building justice where oppression had previously reigned. Most remarkably, she saw her own role in this vast historical drama, not as someone meant to prevent the war, but as a voice calling the nation to remember its highest ideals, even amid its darkest hours. Her prophecies would serve as a moral compass during times when traditional leadership failed, reminding Americans that their suffering served purposes larger than their immediate pain. When Elena opened her eyes, tears streamed down her cheeks, but her expression carried profound peace. "Reverend Matthews," she said gently, "the conflict that approaches cannot be prevented because it serves purposes beyond our current understanding. Your role is not to stop what's coming, but to help your people remember God's love even when they forget everything else. The war will test our nation's soul, but it will also reveal the possibility of redemption through sacrifice." The ministers left her office that day, carrying a message they had not expected: that faithful people could serve God's purposes even within systems they could not immediately change, that patient love often accomplished more than righteous anger, and that divine will sometimes work through apparent defeat to achieve ultimate victory. Elena's evolving understanding of prophecy as spiritual guidance rather than simple prediction transformed her approach to consulting with government officials. When Secretary of War Simon Cameron requested her insights about military preparations, she focused not on tactical advantages but on strategies that might preserve honor and humanity even during necessary conflicts. "Mr. Secretary," Elena explained, "during their consultation, my visions show that the approaching war will test our nation's character as much as its military capabilities. Victory achieved through dishonorable means will prove more costly than defeat endured with integrity." Secretary Cameron, a practical man focused on immediate concerns, struggled to understand Elena's perspective. "Miss Vasquez, surely you recognize that war requires difficult choices that peacetime morality cannot accommodate. How do we prepare for conflict while maintaining the idealistic standards you describe?" Elena's gift provided immediate clarity about the Secretary's question. By remembering that how we fight determines who we become afterward, the methods we employ during war will shape the peace that follows. If we preserve our moral foundations during conflict, we can build something better when fighting ends. If we abandon our principles for temporary advantage, victory itself becomes meaningless. The Secretary left their meeting carrying recommendations that would influence military policies throughout the coming conflict: guidelines for treating prisoners humanely, protocols for protecting civilian populations, and strategies for maintaining democratic governance even under wartime pressures. Elena's influence during the war years extended far beyond government consultations. She became a voice of moral clarity for ordinary citizens struggling to understand how their faith could coexist with the violence surrounding them. Her letters, published in newspapers across the nation, provided spiritual comfort for families whose sons marched off to battle and practical guidance for communities torn apart by conflicting loyalties. one of her most influential letters addressed the mothers of soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Dear sisters in sorrow and hope, I write to you not as prophet or counselor, but as one woman to others who carry tomorrow's grief in today's heart. The sons you have given to this conflict serve purposes larger than any human planning could arrange. Whether they wear blue or gray, they participate in a national reckoning that will determine whether freedom or oppression defines our children's inheritance. Your tears water the ground from which a more perfect union will grow. Your prayers sustain the spiritual foundations that will outlast every battlefield. Your love demonstrates the divine character that makes this suffering meaningful rather than merely tragic. The letter was reprinted in hundreds of newspapers and read aloud in thousands of churches, providing comfort and perspective to families whose sacrifice seemed senseless without the broader context. Elena's gift revealed, but Elena's most profound contribution during the war came through her work with the Underground Railroad, where her prophetic insights proved invaluable for planning escape routes and avoiding capture. She could foresee which paths would be safe, which conductors might be compromised, and which safe houses faced imminent discovery. Harriet Tubman sought Elena's consultation before several of her most dangerous missions, finding that prophetic guidance dramatically improved her success rate in leading escaped slaves to freedom. The two women developed a deep friendship based on their shared commitment to using extraordinary gifts in service of human liberation. Elena, Harriet said during one of their planning sessions, your gift and mine work together like rivers, flowing toward the same sea. You see the safe paths, and I walk them. Together, we carry God's people toward the promised land. Elena's collaboration with Harriet Tubman revealed new dimensions of her prophetic calling, the ability to see not just individual futures, but collective destinies that shaped entire communities' movement toward freedom and justice. Her visions began encompassing migration patterns, social transformations, and cultural developments that would unfold over generations. During the war's final year, Elena experienced her most comprehensive vision yet, a detailed preview of reconstructions, challenges and opportunities that would guide her ministry for the remaining decades of her life. She saw the enormous task of rebuilding not just physical infrastructure, but social relationships based on equality rather than oppression. She witnessed the resistance that would emerge from those who preferred familiar injustice to unfamiliar equality. Most importantly, she saw opportunities for establishing institutions that would preserve the moral gains achieved through wartime sacrifice. When the war finally ended, Elena was already prepared with detailed plans for the Freedmen's Education Initiative, a network of schools and training programs designed to help former slaves develop the skills needed for full participation in democratic society. Her prophetic insights allowed the initiative to anticipate and address challenges that would have otherwise undermined similar efforts. Elena's post-war ministry focused increasingly on what she called prophetic institution building, using her gift to design organizations and systems that would serve human flourishing long after her own voice fell silent. She helped establish universities that would educate leaders for the next century, hospitals that would pioneer new approaches to medical care, and legal advocacy organizations that would protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Marcus proved essential to this institutional work, his practical wisdom complementing Elena's visionary insights to create organizations that balanced idealistic purpose with realistic operational procedures. Their partnership had evolved into something unprecedented, a prophetic marriage that demonstrated how divine gifts could be amplified through committed human relationship. Their children inherited not just Elena's prophetic abilities, but also Marcus's grounding wisdom and both parents' commitment to serving others. The family became a model for how extraordinary gifts could be, nurtured within healthy relationships rather than isolating their bearers from normal human community. Elena's oldest daughter, Maria, showed particular promise as a healer whose visions focused on medical innovations that could prevent illness rather than simply treating disease. Elena carefully guided Maria's development, teaching her how to translate prophetic insight into practical medical knowledge that could be shared with trained physicians. Her son James inherited his father's building skills, along with prophetic visions about architectural innovations that could create healthier, more sustainable communities. Elena encouraged him to pursue formal engineering education while developing his spiritual gifts, creating a unique combination of technical expertise and divine insight. Elena's youngest daughter, Hope, demonstrated the most comprehensive prophetic abilities of all the children, with visions that spanned multiple generations and encompassed global rather than merely national concerns. Elena recognized that Hope's gift would eventually surpass her own, requiring preparation for challenges that would extend far beyond anything Elena herself had encountered. "Hope," Elena explained during one of their mentoring sessions, "your gift will serve a world larger and more complex than anything I've experienced. My prophecies focus primarily on our nation's development, but yours will need to address global conflicts, international cooperation, and challenges that span continents." Hope, now 16 and mature beyond her years, nodded gravely. "Mother, I see visions of technologies that could help or harm humanity depending on how they're used. Flying machines that could carry medicine to remote areas or bombs to destroy cities. Communication devices that could unite distant peoples or spread dangerous lies. How do I guide such choices?" Elena smiled, recognizing that her daughter had already grasped the essential wisdom of prophetic service, that divine gifts must always be wielded in service of love rather than power, healing rather than harm. "The same way I learned, sweetheart. By trusting that the God who gives us these visions also provides the wisdom needed to use them well. By surrounding yourself with people who share your commitment to serving others. And by remembering that prophecy is never about controlling the future, but about serving it with faith and love." As Elena entered the final decade of her active ministry, she increasingly focused on documenting the principles and practices she had developed for prophetic service. Her book, Tomorrow's Light, A Guide to Prophetic Ministry, became the foundational text for training future generations of prophetically gifted individuals. The book emphasized several key insights Elena had gained through decades of experience. Prophetic gifts serve others, never the prophet. Any use of divine insight for personal advantage corrupts both the gift and the recipient. Prophecy reveals possibility, not inevitability. Even the most detailed visions show what might happen based on current trends, but human choice can always alter outcomes. Community provides essential grounding for prophetic service. Isolated prophets often become either arrogant or overwhelmed, while those supported by wise communities can serve effectively for decades. Prophetic ministry requires constant spiritual discipline. Regular prayer, meditation, and study prevent gifts from becoming mechanical or self-serving. Truth-telling demands courage more than ability. Many prophets see clearly but lack the strength to share difficult messages. Courage, not vision, often determines a prophet's effectiveness. Elena's legacy extended far beyond her personal ministry. The institution she founded continued serving others for generations, while the principles she articulated became standard training for prophetic ministers across multiple religious traditions. Her story demonstrated that divine gifts, properly understood and faithfully employed, could serve the common good rather than isolating their bearers from the human community. When Elena finally passed away at age 73, surrounded by family and friends who had shared her journey from isolation to influence, her funeral became a celebration of prophetic service rather than a mourning for lost gifts. Speakers from across the nation testified to the ways Elena's ministry had blessed their communities, prevented disasters, and provided hope during dark times. Marcus, now elderly but still strong, delivered the final tribute to his beloved wife and partner. Elena Vasquez showed us that tomorrow need not be feared, when today is lived in faithful service to others. Her prophecies blessed our nation because they emerged from a heart committed to love rather than power, to healing rather than harm. She transformed curse into calling by choosing service over safety, truth over comfort, and love over fear. Her greatest prophecy was the life she lived, proof that divine gifts can bless humanity when wielded by hands guided by wisdom and hearts grounded in love. Elena Vasquez had learned to see tomorrow not as fate to be endured, but as a possibility, to be shaped through love, faith, and the proper use of divine gifts. Her story would inspire generations of prophets who followed, teaching them that the greatest prophecy is always the vision of a better future made real through human choice and divine grace. The woman who had slept beside her mother's grave in despair had awakened to discover that tomorrow was indeed worth believing in, and that one faithful voice, properly supported and wisely guided, could illuminate paths toward hope for countless others walking in darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.